Good morning, afternoon, or evening, whenever you're watching this. We're going to be going over the psychosocial development of middle age or middle adulthood, which covers ages 35 to 65. So let's start with Erik Erikson, and his crisis at this period is generativity versus stagnation. When you think of generativity, think of the word generate. And that's the ability to be useful, not just to ourselves, but to society as a whole. And the emphasis is on being helpful to others. And recognizing that the act of being productive is rewarding, regardless of the recognition or rewards. So as we get older, we tend to look at how we can help society, help our family, help the people that we may be close to, or people that we don't even know. Now, if you do not overcome the crisis, what you fall victim to is something called stagnation. And if you think of a pond that is stagnant, there's nothing alive, it's just algae and pollution and litter laying in this pond. And that's basically what you're looking at with someone who is stagnant in middle adulthood. These people become bored, self-indulgent. They're unable to contribute to society's welfare, and they absolutely cannot solve their own problems. They blame everyone else. So, for example, I know someone who lost their job, and of course, who do they blame? They're blaming Obama. The fact that they didn't go to work on time and they kept getting written up for being late. That, of course, is also Obama's fault. So when we look at these kinds of scenarios, we have to think about a person who blames everyone but themselves for their issues, and they don't try to solve their own problems. When we are looking at middle adulthood, one of the big issues is stress. And as you enter middle adulthood, you begin to feel stress more strongly. The more responsibilities you have, the more stress you have. So some of the big issues that we're looking at, poverty, and even beyond poverty, is money problems. You know, when we look at an adult, 35, 40 years old, they have a family, they usually have a house, they have bills to pay, and having money problems can be extremely stressful because your family is relying on you to help them out and to be there for them. So that sense of responsibility, especially when it comes to money, is very overwhelming. Another issue is chronic illness, things like heart disease, high blood pressure, high cholesterol. All of these issues become very apparent when you enter middle age, and you have to manage and deal with them. Then you also have mental illness. Depression is the most popular of the mental illnesses. About 16% of the population go through a depression lasting at least 6 months. So we're talking about a significant portion of the population. Drug abuse, meaning drug abuse and alcohol abuse. A lot of people will use drugs and alcohols to self-medicate because they're dealing with stress. Exposure to violence, whether it's in the household, mom or dad beats the kids or beats on each other, or in the neighborhood. A lot of lower socioeconomic households deal with the fact that there are people outside their door shooting at one another, and this causes a lot of anxiety. Divorce, which we've talked about to some extent, but divorce is a very stressful time. The person who you love and who validates you now is done with you. And then teenagers having children. So if you are the parent of a 16-year-old who comes home and says, "Mom or Dad, I'm pregnant," that's going to cause a whole new boatload of stress that you have to deal with. Because at the same time that you're looking at your baby is now going to have a baby. And you have to get them up to speed on how to be mature enough to be a parent. Now, some things will help a family, and especially a person. These are called protective factors. And these are characteristics of a resilient person who manages stress well. They have a strong family environment. They have a good support network of friends. And they have certain personality traits that allow them to overcome those moments of complete anxiety and stress. Things like being able to be resilient, to understand that life goes on, that it's not the end of the world, even though it may feel like it, can oftentimes be the difference between having a good protective factor and a bad protective factor. So let's talk about being single in middle adulthood, because it's pretty rare. Approximately 1 in 20 who have reached middle age have never been married, so that's about 5%. And if you haven't been married by the time you're 35, it's very unlikely that you will get married. Now, the determination in all of this is education. You are less likely to get married if you have very low education, meaning 5 years or less, because this is indicative of someone who is severely handicapped, who suffers from developmental delays, or has a particular mental illness. And these folks neither have the intellectual capacity or oftentimes the emotional ability to bond significantly with another person, and therefore they do not find a person to spend their life with. On the other end of the spectrum are people with very high levels of education. So somebody who's gone through college and graduate school and maybe their PhD level oftentimes do not get married. The statistic is 13% of women with 17 years of education have never been married, and that's graduate school level. So why do highly educated women stay single? And it's a few reasons. One, they decide to focus on their education and career over love. And, as most of us know, that when you fall in love, you are consumed by it. And if someone is really dedicated to focusing in on their life, their professional life, they may choose to not worry about love so much. Also, men oftentimes feel threatened by women with more education than they have. I will say I think this is changing as the millennials come of age. The folks who are closer to Gen X, meaning born before 1982, or people who are the baby boomers born before 1964, tend to have those more traditional views that women should not be on an equal footing with men. But like I said, the millennials who were raised by strong working women don't seem to have a problem with that. Additionally, by the time a woman has completed her schooling, there is a much smaller pool of men available. So if you're in college till you're almost 30 and all the men are married by 28, you're going to have a lot less men to choose from. And a lot of really smart women don't want to settle for what's left. Now, middle age is also a time when their spouses reevaluate their marriage. They examine current relationships and consider changes in the future. The person that you fell in love with at 24 or 25 is going to be very different from the person you're living with at 40. And it's because life changes you. It's like watching the weather influence nature. Some days there's flowers growing in the garden, and then the next everything is dying because the weather is changing. And it's the same thing with people. Our experiences change who we are. And the more trauma we experience, the more we change. Another aspect of that is children become less dependent upon their parents. The tension that exists between the spouses becomes more evident. So, when you have 2 young children that you are in charge of, you're focused on them. But when those kids don't need you as much, they're in high school, they're going out, they're spending weekends with their friends, that leaves you and your spouse alone to look at each other and go, I don't even know this person anymore. Now, to kind of back up a little bit, most couples who divorce are likely to separate within the first 5 years of marriage. So, even though there's a lot of reevaluation of marriage, most couples stay married. They may go to counseling, they may change the way they communicate or interact because they've invested in one another and they're not really ready to walk away. Whereas the people who are most likely to get divorced are young, been married less than 5 years, and don't have very many assets. So let's talk about what makes a marriage a happy one. First, you got to be friends with your spouse. You got to like them. You have to want to spend time with them. You have to have things in common. Love, that emotional affection. Do you snuggle in bed at night? Do you cuddle in the mornings? Do you sit on the couch with your feet in his or her lap? There's all these little emotional, intimate things that couples do, and you have to ask yourself where you rank on that level with your partner. Sexual compatibility. If he's looking to have sex 3 times a week and you want to have sex 3 times a year, that is definitely not going to be a compatibility. But that's where compromise comes in, and that's where couples have to work together to ensure that they meet each other's not just emotional needs but physical needs. Similar interests, similar backgrounds. We've talked about this under the young adulthood. How well each spouse can balance the roles they take on in the family. A lot of times, one member of the relationship will take on a lot more responsibility than the other one. So women oftentimes do this. They'll be the parent, they'll be the housekeeper, they'll have a full-time job, they'll be the chauffeur for the kids who need to get driven around, and all dad has to do is mow the lawn. So again, the more modern generations, the millennials, are better at splitting the tasks. And it's really up to the older generations to kind of assess where the balance needs to come in. And if that means dad gets to do the vacuuming and fill the dishwasher so that mom can take a bath once in a while, so be it. The ability to listen to one another and compromise. And then this might be one of the most important aspects, maintaining respect for one another. If you don't respect your spouse, you're not going to want to have anything to do with them, because that's generally how we feel about respect. When you disrespect someone, you have no feelings of admiration for them. So with a spouse, you have to admire them in some ways. So let's talk about divorce. The highest divorce rates are amongst the following groups. People who are in their second marriage or subsequent marriage. So there's people who've been married 5, 6, 7 times. They know you can survive a divorce. You get through it. And you can move on to the next person. There's serial divorcers. People who have never been divorced are sometimes frightened of the process. So they're willing to take a moment and say, I'm going to try again so that I don't have to go through this. Less educated and lower earning ability. And the logic behind this is that people who are less educated tend to not make as much money as people who are educated. People who make more money tend to have more assets. The house, the cars, the pension plan, the retirement plan, the stocks and the bonds. So people who have a lot of assets oftentimes will stay married through a bumpy patch because they don't want to have to divide up their assets. They don't want to have to lose money when they're cashing in their assets. So people who don't have much to split. So the person who's got they have a car, they have an apartment, and they have no money, really, there's not much to split. So it's easy to get a divorce when you don't have a lot. Couples who are less likely to divorce have the following characteristics. They've been in their marriage a long time. If you make it past that 5-year mark, there's a good chance your marriage will survive the long term. And then the complex economic and property linkages. Those are all the pensions, the owning the homes together, owning pension plans, owning stocks and bonds. Another issue is the web of social relationships. Married people tend to hang out with other married people. And as such, when a couple gets divorced, who gets to keep the friends? And that becomes an awful situation, not just for the couple who are divorcing, but for the friends who are trying to support them. And then last, have a higher standard of living. The more you have, the less you're willing to give it up. That's the basic bottom line on that one. So let's look at women specifically. Divorced women at midlife especially experience economic hardship. They have a significant decline in income. And again, I just want to reiterate that we're looking at generations for the past 30 or 40 years. We're not looking at the 20-year-olds moving forward. So you have to keep in mind that the social expectations for women prior to the middle of the 1980s, early 90s, was that they worked for a little bit, got married, had babies, stayed home, and became housewives. So if you're a housewife and you haven't worked in 12 years or 15 years, there's not a lot you can do to get a job that's going to pay really, really well. So a lot of these women come out of a marriage with very little opportunities to make the kind of money that they and their husband were making together, as she stayed home and kept an eye on the kids and he went to work. As a consequence, they experience increased rates of poverty, dramatic lifestyle changes, and a lot of times these women find that they cannot improve their economic situation unless they remarry. And, so they're on a husband hunt who will keep them in the style that they were accustomed to. So you get a divorce, and now if you have children, especially small children, you are a single parent. And 30% of all children under the age of 18 live with just one parent. And 84% of the time, the mother is the single parent. So single mothers, the rate has more than doubled in the last 30 years. We're looking at 26% now. And again, what you're seeing is women who are divorcing today have a much better economic handle on it than they did 10 years ago. So let's say you stay married and Junior goes off to college or graduates from college and gets a job on the other side of the country, and now he's gone. What parents often experience is something called empty nest syndrome. And this is the feeling of depression, grief, and loneliness parents may feel when their children leave home for the first time. So the goal of raising your children successfully has been accomplished. So now what? And so parents oftentimes go through this period of where they just don't know what happens next. Then we have our own parents to deal with in middle age. With the advances in medical science, people are living longer and longer. So in 1900, the average age that people lived to was in their 40s. Now people live to be almost 80. So in the 115 years since 1900, we have literally doubled our life expectancy. So our parents tend to be around with us for a very long time. The good news is that relationships with parents tend to improve. People gain perspective on how hard being a parent is. There's nothing like cleaning up a 3-year-old's vomit at 2 o'clock in the morning to make you appreciate your own mom and dad. Grandchildren strengthen bonds within a family. So grandma and grandpa become very important to their grandchildren. And as an elderly parent grows older, they sometimes become dependent on their middle-aged children. So that's another element that you yourself will have to deal with as you go into your 30s and 40s is, how healthy are your parents? Do you have to go there every day to make sure that they're eating? Do you have to help them with their finances? Do you have to help them make sure that they pay their bills? Things like that become challenging for people in their middle age because they're being squeezed not only from their own children, but now they're having to parent their own parents. And this causes a lot of that stress I was talking about at the beginning of this PowerPoint. So when you become your parent's caregiver, you experience a lot of this stress that comes with the emotional issues. Your mom and dad were the people who basically, kept you from having fun in your teenage years, So there's a lot of anxiety and issues built up with the emotions of being a parent. And then, as you got older, they would judge you. And now you have to be there for them. And, some of the activities, it's one thing to change a 4-month-old diaper. But when you have to change your 80-year-old parent's diaper, there's a lot of issues with that. And so people have a lot of emotions that they need to process. There's also the issue of time constraints. If you're up at 5 in the morning, getting your kids to school, going to work all day, coming home, having to check in on mom or dad to make sure they're okay, coming home then to make dinner for the family, you literally lose a huge part of your downtime because you now have to take care of mom or dad, which then affects your own health. So you might suffer from various and sundry illnesses because you're so exhausted that your immune system is not working at its maximum capacity. And lastly, female caregivers tend to get more depressed than male caregivers. And a huge element is that women tend to be the primary caregiver. You see it changing a little bit with, again, the millennial generation, but for the vast majority of people who are in their middle age now, it's the women, if not the daughter, then the daughter-in-law, who have to show up and be the caregiver. Well, let's talk about something a little bit less depressing. How about friendships? So around age 30, people tend to choose a few select relationships to maintain. These are the ones that usually provide support, agree with how you define yourself, your own identity, and they offer stability. This is when those toxic friendships become too problematic to maintain, and you walk away. And a lot of times you'll feel guilt over it, but they make your life easier because you're not dealing with the craziness that toxic people bring to your life. So, remember Levinson when we talked about young adulthood? Well, he also talked about middle adulthood. And again, a lot of this is very similar for women now. So he said around age 33, your average man is content to settle down. He has 2 tasks that he continues to work on. He is establishing his niche in society, and he's moving up the occupational ladder. So, for example, if you get hired at 25 or 26 at a computer company and you're working in low-level programming, by the time you're 30, you may be promoted to a management position, and then you become more focused on moving up to the next level. You see the rewards. You are more respected. You make more money. People look at you differently, and that is a very appealing thing. So you want to move up in that job. Establishing a niche in society. Who do you want to be? A lot of people at this age look at what they can contribute to society. People begin to enter politics. People want to change their community for the better. They begin to participate in charitable functions more often. So you see them looking at the world in a much different way. It's more about the world and not about themselves. Around age 40 to 45, men experience a midlife transition. They begin to feel the effects of aging. After a night of drinking a few beers, you wake up in the morning, and if you're 25, no problem. You get up, you go play basketball, and you're fine. When you're in your 40s, you wake up the next day, and you realize that you're not going to get out of bed for another couple hours because you feel like your head's going to explode. We all have these impacts of aging, and we have to manage them. We realize that we have made mistakes, and those mistakes are not something that we're going to beat ourselves up over, but we have a better sense of what is right and what is wrong in terms of the choices we make. And then men also begin to develop better relationships with women. And there's been some discussion that this is related to the sex drive beginning to diminish. It's not where your average 20-year-old guy meets a girl and she immediately falls into the category of would he do her or would he not do her. So men at this age look at women as more rounded people, not just a viable sex partner. And that's not to say that all men are like that, but men definitely have a very specific visual sexual response to a lot of women. The other thing with men at this point is that they're not stressed out by being alone. They can spend the day alone. They don't need to communicate with everybody. They don't need to be out in the world. They can spend the day in their house watching TV, reading a book, enjoying time by themselves. So we're going to talk now about something called the 5-factor model of personality. And this has been something that's been widely studied. And these are 5 factors that tend to have consistent patterns of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors over our lifespan. In other words, if you measure the neuroticism, in this case, out of a person at 20, it's going to be around the same at 25 or 30, 40, 50, 60, and so on. Now, there are going to be changes, but I'll talk about them in a few minutes. So the first factor is neuroticism, and this is the tendency to experience some kind of breakdown under stress. And what you see is a person who is a perfectionist tends to suffer from stress in a much more visual way than somebody who's more laid back. So a well-balanced person is on the other side of neurotic. So a person who's very, very neurotic is going to be neurotic for most of their lives. Somebody who's well-balanced at 20 is going to be pretty well-balanced throughout their life. Then the next one is extroversion, and this is the tendency to be outgoing and social. These people have an overriding interest in the people and social outcomes or connections around them. And again, you can be an introvert, meaning you prefer to spend time alone, you're not really interested in socializing with people that much, versus on the other end of the scale, the extrovert. Number 3, openness to experience. Openness to new ideas, actions, and feelings. Not being a rigid person who defines their world very small segments. So someone who is very rigid doesn't want to try something new. Whether it's a new restaurant, a new activity, a new beach, they like to do things the way that they did it for the last 20 years. On the other side, of course, is somebody who is open to new experiences. Number 4 is agreeableness, and this is the willingness to cooperate and defer to others in social interactions. They want to avoid conflict. So on the one end of the scale, you have someone who likes to fight with everyone all the time. And on the other end of the scale is you have somebody who's cooperative. They want everybody to get along. They want everybody to enjoy spending time together. Number 5, conscientiousness. A strong sense of purpose with high expectation. People with a high level of conscientiousness tend to follow leadership positions. So on the one end of the scale, you are careless, and on the other end, you are conscientious. So these 5 factors pretty much remain stable for our lifetimes. Can anything impact the 5-factor model of personality? And absolutely they can. Success in business has a huge factor in changing the way we see somebody or something. Somebody who is very introverted may find a huge amount of success in their jobs, and that turns them into somebody who's an extrovert. Sexual attractiveness. If you are a gorgeous human being and you are gorgeous throughout your life, you are going to get a lot of positive reinforcement from society, which may change you from being a careless person to a conscientious person, or a conflict-based person to a cooperative person. This is a picture of somebody who is around my age, Angie Harmon, who's on Rizzoli and Isles. She was a model as a teenager. She's 16 at this stage. She won a contest at age 15 or 16 to be on the cover of 17 magazine. And, clearly this woman has stayed gorgeous through her whole life. And when you have someone who has that level of beauty, it can change the way you see yourself and the way you act. Another issue is culture. People who are in a culture where showing off is perceived as a good thing are going to be a little bit more extroverted than somebody who is not in a culture that encourages people to show off. And then also another issue that can impact the consistency of our personality are mental disorders. Depression, as I mentioned, affects 16% of the population every year. So, people who suffer from significant depression oftentimes are unable to move forward in their lives, and they may be an extrovert as a young person, and then a long-term depression will turn them into an introvert. In a study of college-educated women's personalities, middle adulthood showed a marked sense of personal identity and confidence in personal worth. And remember, women become more understanding of their own sense of self after they get into a relationship, and then take it to that next level, and a woman who is now in her 30s or 40s has a better sense of who she is, who she wants to be, and that helps her develop a better sense of confidence and personal identity. Recently, a study was done discussing how age and gender affects the 5 factors, and they were looking specifically at people over the age of 30. Conscientiousness, women, the change slows but does not stop after age 30. Men, same thing, the change slows but does not change after age 30. So we're seeing incremental changes. It doesn't mean that to be consistent means to be the same. It's just your sense of who you are is going to change a small bit, and that is going to be reflected in these particular perspectives. Agreeableness, both men and women become more cooperative as they get older. Neuroticism, women tend to stay the same. There's very little change, so a neurotic woman at 25 is going to be the same neurotic woman at 45. And again, with men, you see a little bit of a change, but not much. So neuroses or neuroticism tends to stay the same through your lifespan. Openness, a woman who's open as a young person tends to become less open as an older person, and men tend to become more open as they get older. Women, a woman who is an extrovert when she's young tends to become more introverted when she is older, and vice versa. So an introverted woman in her 20s will be more likely to be extroverted when she is in her 30s and 40s. And for men, it pretty much slows, but it doesn't change too much after age 30. So a man who's an extrovert is going to probably stay an extrovert for the rest of his life. So that finishes up this lecture. If you have any questions, please feel free to text or email me. I hope you have a great day.